Chaina's Torment. Chapter 26. Chaina made his way back to the chambers. He did not go unchallenged, but he might as well have. A small band of Nantuko pounced on him as he came off the platform, but they were quickly collared and absorbed. Chaina broke a few bones with a weighted chain as he went, but for the most part the fighters gave him a wide berth, and the spectators ran at the sight of him. One of the first toys was buzzing as he opened the door. It was a handheld mirror with a talking octopus in its glass. Chaina made a half-hearted stab to figure out what she wanted, then shattered the mirror over his knee. He had more important things to occupy his time. The Mirari was as he left it, under the pyramid of paper in the corner of the smallest room. No one dared enter his chamber after he had deposed the first, and he doubted anyone would have believed him audacious enough to hide it there anyway. He took the glowing black sphere in his hands and once again marveled at the depths of its power it contained. He should have used it to find a way to kill the first. Cabal City was nothing to him now, and worse, it was an obstacle. He would have to tear it all down before he could build it back up again properly. Chaina drew the power into him and began to shape it. What he had in mind was complicated and would happen on scale undreamed of by even the most fervid Dementist. He reached out into Cabal City and beyond to Afeto. His mind flew out past the Crozon, across all of Otaria, and beyond into the depths of Mur. He could see and feel every dementia caster there was, each of them linked by their power and their oath to the Cabal. He felt a few dead spots in his continental sweep, a few individuals who could not be contacted. Fuller, for example, and a handful of casters in Afeto. Perhaps the truly disconnected were beyond even the Mirari's reach. No matter, he thought. He had more than enough. The Cabal taught them the ways of power, and they in turn used that power to benefit the Cabal. But the Cabal was dead now, just waiting to be buried. It was time for a new covenant, one that Chaina would enforce. All across the land he felt casters stop, freeze, and remain rigid. Skellum had always said that a master needs pupils, and in one stroke Chaina had more than any master who had ever lived. With the Mirari he could enter each of their minds and commandeer them. He could occupy all the dementia space there was and turn it towards his goals. He could assemble the largest and most diverse army of dementia monsters that had ever been. "Like this!" he cried, and he was suddenly back in his own dementia space, even as he remained in his chambers. Both locations superimposed on top of each other, fusing and separating over and over. It was empty there as it had been when he first arrived, and Chaina suddenly felt very small and lonely. He had been expecting a multitude, and he was unnerved by the complete lack of company. Where had they all gone? He heard a fresh scream nearby, and he appeared back in his chambers. They were all around him, sprawled across his floor and spilling out into the hall, visible in the courtyards outside his window and throughout the streets of Cabal City. 1,000,000 monsters or more howled and hunted and rampaged and roared. Twisted nightmare versions of people. Animals, birds, snakes, fantastic beasts from the forest, and terrifying monsters from the depths all lashed out at themselves and the world around them. Chaina had opened the floodgates of his mind, and the Mirari was keeping them open. Chaina laughed and sat on a pile of paper with the Mirari in his lap as the entire city wailed in horror. The Cabal is here! And nowhere else! Kamal had never seen such chaos. It became difficult to tell who was real and who was a summoning, and impossible to tell which side they were on. Harpy fought angel, zombie fought trooper, and all manner of things that never had names fought beasts from the forest that had never been seen. Kamal did not consider himself a brilliant man, but he knew how to learn from experience. An out-of-control catastrophe spelled Mirari, and a flood of monsters spelled Chaina. Kamal concentrated. He could feel the sphere's presence. His former partner had finally fallen victim to the Mirari's curse. It was not hard to locate the Mirari, and Kamal made his way through the killing floor as fast as his wounds permitted. There were plenty of victims to go around, and Kamal encouraged a few of the monsters to find easier pickings with the tip of his sword. Before long, he was at the end of a long hallway that led to Chaina and the Mirari. "Chaina!" he bellowed. A hissing snake man attacked him, and Kamal burned its throat out where it stood. Is that my old friend and partner? Chaina's voice called back. Come on out, old friend! Let's finish this. The flood of sprawling monsters pouring out of the chamber door momentarily increased just before Chaina came through it. The creatures fled past Kamal without looking at him. They were far more interested in getting away from their master. Chaina's braided hair splayed around his head like a crown. Chaina's eyes were black again, but the void had spilled out of the sockets and was obscuring the top half of his face. His feet floated 6 inches above the ground and he held the Mirari in his metal hand. He was smiling. Kamal, Chainer, have you come to apologize or to kill me and take the Mirari? Neither. I've come to stop you. Stop me? From what? From destroying yourself. From destroying this city. From destroying everything. Chaina's smile faded. Still looking out for me, big brother? I have a bad history with authority figures, you know? They always die or betray me. I'm not your brother, Chainer. I'm your friend. Listen to me. You've got to put the Mirari down. You're going to get us all killed. We have to get killed, Chaina fled. We have to destroy before I can rebuild. If you don't put it down, I'm gonna put you down. Chaina smiled again. Ah, Fritz, I don't really think you have a chance, do you? Enough talk. Chaina drew his sword. Now we fight. You don't look healthy enough to fight. I'm healthy enough to fight you. Not your monster pawns, not the Mirari. You. I don't need pawns, Chaina said darkly. He gestured at Kamal's weapon. Don't you know that no one with a sword can get the best of someone with a chain? That's why I carry this thing. Then let's go. You're right, Chaina. I'm not healed. But this isn't the pits. There isn't a scheduled conclusion to this fight. Care to test your skill? Chaina's eyes twinkled. Are you proposing that we come to some sort of an arrangement? No arrangement, no tricks. Just by a plain challenge. I say I can take you using nothing but my sword. Can you take me with a length of chain? And my dagger. I used to use that too. And your dagger. Come on, Chainer. It's you and me. We both fought for the Mirari. Now we can fight fair. And may the best man win. Done, Chainer said. He tossed the Mirari through the open door into the next room and squared off against his former partner. Kamal breathed a sigh of relief. At least the building wouldn't go up in a black cloud of debris and body parts while they were fighting. Now all he had to do was to overcome the pain of his wounds and the fatigue in his body to defeat his insane ex-partner who could kill with a gesture and created both weapons and monsters out of thin air. After he had done that, Kamal promised himself he would look into some other kind of work. Veza swam for all she was worth, but Burke caught her just outside the chasm. He never seemed to get tired, and Veza simply could not keep up the pace. From the mirror around his bodyguard's neck, Loquatus watched as Veza was recaptured. Now you are mine, Loquatus said, along with the Empire. Veza struggled in Burke's grip, but she was staring at the war being waged around her. In the distance, something new was happening on the battlefield. Veza allowed herself a small smile. Nothing is yours yet, Loquatus. Emperor, a mercenary's voice said, are you seeing this? Seeing what? Look at the battle! Look! By the depths! What's going on? Veza looked. Inexplicably, the hundreds and hundreds of serpent warriors who had been grappling with Lawan's soldiers were vanishing in mid-blow. His mercenaries found themselves face to face with trained Imperial guards, and the guards adjusted much more quickly than their new opponents. Within seconds of the final serpent's disappearance, 100 of Loquatus's mercenaries fell dead, and the rest fell back into disarray. Perhaps you only rented those warriors from the Cabal, Veza called into the mirror. I'll bet it's not too late to get your deposit back. Get my troops back inside the chasm. Burke, kill that wench and bring her body back here. Veza didn't wait for Burke to comply. Instead, she clamped onto the gentleman's thumb with her short, sharp teeth. With a wrench that nearly dislocated her jaw, she tore the digit off and spit it back in the owner's face. Minus his thumb, Burke could not maintain his grip on Veza's wrist, and she would be able to kick her way free and dart out into the open ocean. Burke was close behind, however. Apparently he took any orders Loquatus gave him to heart. He elongated his feet to give him more drive, and with each stroke he stretched his arms a little closer to Vezza. When his fingers brushed Vezza's foot, she panicked and dove for a seabed. Burke changed course even quicker than she did, and actually gained on her before she could hide among the seaweed and silt. She needed to go faster. She needed her tail. But it was impossible, though. She couldn't change while moving, and the transformation was extremely painful. Burke would be on her before the process had even begun. Just as his hand closed around her leg, the Empress's ship swam into view. Burke snapped Vez's ankle, and she sank painfully into the sand. She cradled her injured leg and wondered why he wasn't finishing her off. She looked up and saw the reason. Burke was beset by the Empress's barracuda. All 12 of her spindly killer fish circled around him, breaking their teeth on his body and occasionally ripping small chunks off. The pieces of Burke's body immediately floated back and rejoined the main mass. The barracuda were ill-equipped to deal with something that didn't panic, bleed, or feel pain. Burke, on the other hand, was killing the barracuda with both hands. They were strong, and they were fierce, but they were not faster than Burke, and they had bones he could break. 5 of the fish already floated dead in the water around him. In a matter of seconds he would be through with them, and ready to finish off Vezza. Vezza concentrated. Loquatus was wrong. Magic wasn't about being mentally, physically, and morally flexible. It was about understanding the world and your place in it. Vezza felt the powerful tides flowing out of the chasm, felt the palpable force of the civil war around her, felt the bond between the barracuda and Lawan. I am a servant of Mer, Vezza reminded herself. I am of the sea. Change, she commanded, and her legs merged seamlessly and painlessly into a powerful fish's tail. Burke was finishing off the last of the barracuda when he noticed Vezza's metamorphosis. He elongated his arm across the gap between them to clutch at her throat, but she shot off like an arrow through the water. She laughed, exhilarated as she screamed towards the Empress's vessel, until she felt Burke's hand close around her lower extremities once more. The gel-man's arm had continued to stretch after her as she swam, and now he had snared her in a long, tough line of his own bodily substance. He didn't have much power at this distance, but he was able to hold her fast. She now outweighed Burke, so he couldn't draw her towards him, but he was quickly pulling himself closer to her by retracting his arm and letting her weight carry him forward. Vezza thrashed and clawed at Burke's unyielding hand. Suddenly, the featureless killer stopped. Through the water, Vezza could make out Loquatus's voice from the mirror around his servant's neck. Burke stood still, nodded, then released Vezza's tail. He struck out, back towards the chasm. Loquatus must have summoned him home. There was a cloud of bubbles and a whirling sensation, and Vezza found herself and the remaining barracuda on the bridge of Lawan's vessel.
Greetings, Vezza. We are so glad to see you alive. Is all as you described it to Al-Shah?
It is, Empress.
Then, my mystic, if you would begin.
The cephalid mystic nodded and once again formed a complicated symbol with his multiple arms. Vezza looked to the screen. All of Loquatus's mercenaries had retreated back into the chasm and were fending off Lawan's troops. Vezza tapped the captain on the shoulder and said,
Pull those guards away from there.
He looked dubious, but he decided not to question her authority. Several seconds later, the Imperial troopers backed off.
All clear, Empress.
Vezza anxiously counted the seconds. Once more, Vezza spotted the flow of the shield defenders' transparent bodies as they positioned themselves in front of the chasm.
The shield is in position.
Lawan clicked, and her shield defenders formed their barrier, larger and thinner than he had ever created before. It sparkled like a sheet of ice, and Vezza could see a ghostly reflection of the Empress's troops in it. Olsham reached out and traced a huge circle in the water before him, and the huge convex shield tilted slightly, sparking at the edges and reflected in light back upon itself. At last, a huge silver-white plane of energy flickered across the transparent shield. The energy flowed past the Empress's servants and continued out to cover the mouth of the chasm. It was almost a mile across, wide enough to overlap the chasm opening by several hundred feet on both sides. It stretched from the ocean floor to the water's surface, and Vezza knew it would stretch across the entire chasm. the magical impulses relayed by the crystals she herself had installed to enclose the entire flood zone in a huge tunnel of mystical energy. A cheer went up among the bridge crew. Olsham and Lawan opened their eyes. Olsham smiled and said,
"Behold, Empress, the largest water portal ever created. Or rather, the largest portal barrier ever created. Nothing outside the chasm can get in, and
Nothing inside can get out. As always, Olsham, you exceed our expectations."
Lawan turned and noticed Veza's wound.
All hail the noble sacrifice made by our comrades, warriors and defenders both. And Captain, get a medic on the bridge, she snapped. Our valued sister is injured. Are you blind?
Sorry, my Empress. Lawan floated down and gathered Veza up in her forelimbs.
Is the damage permanent? No, Empress, I think it's a simple fracture.
She fluxed her tail and winced.
A very painful one, but a simple one. Veza, Lawan said softly, are you sure that Loquatus and all his troops were inside the chasm when the portal was created? Yes, Empress.
Lawan smiled.
Then we have won.
She handed Veza to the medic and began floating back towards the view screen.
Empress? Veza called. You planted the survey data that proved the chasm was valuable, didn't you?
Lawan smiled.
Olsham altered the recording device before he teleported off the ship. So you used me? Not at all. We employed you. We assigned you a task and you performed it. It is the right of the Empress to demand service from her subjects. Service, Empress, or sacrifice? Your Leviathan, its crew, your soldiers and shield defenders, even me?
Lawan scowled.
What is your point, Veza? Loquatus would have sunk the entire empire into economic warfare and decadence. This is why civil wars are fought, to preserve that which is worth preserving, at any cost.
Veza nodded, then floated quietly as the medic examined her tail.
Forgive me, Empress, my wound has made me lightheaded. Of course, when you are healed, Lawan said, you will join us in the palace for an imperial council. We have risked much together, and we do not refer exclusively to your personage. You and all of our loyal subjects either made us Empress or welcomed us as Empress. Now that we have earned that title fairly in combat, we will not forget those who made it possible. We expect a steady flow of constantly good advice from your council. Yes, Empress.
Veza felt herself being taken away, and though she didn't know exactly where she was going, for the first time in months, that wasn't something that she had to worry about. Chaina sent 3 separate chains streaming at Kamal's sword. The first 2 locked and held on the blade, while the first snared Kamal's wrist. Chaina hauled with all his might, but he could not pull the sword loose or Kamal down. Annoyed, he sent another chain coiling around Kamal's foot. With a brutal tug, he finally hauled Kamal off his feet. Kamal dropped his sword as he fell and took hold of the chains himself. When he hit the ground, he yanked hard to pull Chaina towards him. But the chains vanished before Kamal could bring his superior strength and weight into play. A rounded weight broke Kamal's jaw before he could get up.
Guess you'll have to learn how to fight without teeth too, won't you, barbarian?
Chaina's voice was high-pitched and grating. Kamal sneered and spit blood at Chaina. He reached for his sword, but Chaina struck it and sent it skittering across the floor.
I'm getting bored now.
Chaina sank a sharpened weight into Kamal's thigh and another into his shoulder.
I can stand here 20 feet away and whittle you down to nothing. I told you, the sword is useless against the chain.
Kamal stood firm, his breath ragged and blood streaming from his wounds. You should just kill me now, then. There's no audience to be disappointed by a short bout.
Chaina wagged a finger at his partner. Now, we both know you're not that weak.
He slashed another chain at Kamal, but the barbarian ducked under it.
Not yet, anyway.
Kamal conjured an axe and hurled it down the corridor at Chaina. Reflexively, Chaina threw out his hand and released a large, gelatinous mass which absorbed and muffled the explosion.
I thought you said no magic.
I was just trying to clear us some space, Kamal shrugged.
Now you've done it. Now you've made me angry, Chaina said.
He jutted both arms out in the casting position, but instead of the Death Bloom or a Nightmare casting, 10 sharp chains exploded out of his hands, streaming and curling in twisted spirals as they flew towards Kamal. The hallway was not wide enough for him to dodge them all. 6 of them found their way into his body, linking his sword arm and both legs to Chainer. Kamal stiffened but did not fall. He couldn't move, but he would not go down.
The best man wins. That's what you said, isn't it?
Chainer walked casually around the immobilized barbarian. He waved his hand and the Mirari appeared in it.
I think I'll do something really special for you, Kamal. You rejected my gifts once. If I remake you from the bones out of one of my snakes, however, you won't have any choice but to accept it.
Chainer stood less than an arm's length away from Kamal. He reached out his metal arm and daintily flicked Kamal in the chest. The nudge sent Kamal teetering backwards and he began to topple like a great tree. Before he fell, however, Kamal reached out and grabbed Chainer's metal arm.
Let me go, you lump of rock.
Chainer jerked his arm back, but Kamal didn't let go. He clamped down onto the artificial limb with the other hand and steadied himself to his feet. I'm sorry, Chainer, he said, and channeled a withering blast of heat from his own body into Chainer's arm. The metal limb instantly became red hot and Chainer screamed. He dropped the Mirari and drew his dagger, stabbing it into Kamal's forearm. Once, twice, a half-dozen times. Kamal grimly held on through it all, pumping more heat and more energy through his hands. Chainer's arm melted into slag with a wet, angry hiss. He fell backwards and lashed his foot out at Kamal, finally knocking the barbarian onto his back. That was a gift from Skellum, Chainer hissed. Can you barbarians lay off the thrice-damned arm? He kicked Kamal in the ribs as he stepped over his prone body to retrieve the Mirari. He took the sphere in his remaining hand, closed his eyes and concentrated. The smoking end of his stump started to swell, and the new arm began to unfold like an inflating balloon. It wasn't Chainer's arm, or any human's. It was a thin, segmented claw like an insect, and Chainer looked at it in confusion. That's not right, he said. The insect claw vanished, and in its place a large, black rattlesnake sprouted. Chainer scowled at it until it withered. Another attempt produced a mewling, eyeless monstrosity that wailed like a baby until Chainer shook it away. Chainer, what's happening? I don't know, he said. What was happening? How could the Mirari keep failing? Unless he had overtaxed it, of course, he had been communing with the sphere for days, actively using it for the past half hour, and then simply had cast it aside. Of course it was malfunctioning. He wasn't using it properly. He ought to have pulled himself out of the sphere's bottomless well of power before he tried to do something else. Also, it was probably mad at him for abandoning it. Chainer, wait! Shh. Chainer absently flicked his arm towards the helpless barbarian, and a torrent of misshapen snakes and monsters swamped Kamal where he lay. Chainer tried one final time to make himself an arm, but it came out as a lifeless and calloused roll of flesh. Nearby, Kamal was grappling with a tangle of horrors and losing. Chainer shook his head. That wouldn't do. He had promised Kamal a fair fight. In fact, the entire building was getting a bit too noisy and crowded. Chainer needed peace and quiet to kill his friend. He held the Mirari up to help him get it. Chainer! Kamal gurgled from the bottom of the pile. Don't!
Hold on, I'm almost done, Chainer said.
With the sphere in his hand, he once again felt all of the mines he had broken into and pillaged, all of them still frozen and empty. Instead of reaching into those mines, this time Chainer reached out into the world. The other Dementors were merely relay stations for his dementia space, and there was no reason to give back what he had rightfully stolen. He wanted to finish Kamal man to man, however, and for that he needed quiet. Chainer used the Mirari to locate each and every one of the monsters he had unleashed during the games. He was surprised how many of them were left. In fact, there were very few people left alive in the arena around him, and the monsters there had turned on each other. All the more reason to call them home, he thought. The battle's nearly over, and we've already won. All around Ataria, the flow of power reversed as a million nightmares began to flow back into the fragmented brain that created him. This kinda hurts, Chainer said. Is it supposed to hurt? Buried by hostile monsters, Kamal was helpless to stop Chainer. He watched the Cabalist as the Mirai sent blasts of light out in all directions, and then 1,000 smaller beams began flying back into Chaina's body. "This kinda hurts," Chaina said. "Is it supposed to hurt?"
Drop it, Chainer!
Kamal tried to yell more, but something with hooves instead of fists punched him in the mouth. The swarm of monsters stopped tearing at him as the lights beaming into Chaina began to grow larger, faster and more frequent. Kamal was still unable to move, but at least he wasn't being damaged any further. Chaina was screaming now. There were no longer any beams of light slamming into him, but elongated streamers of flesh, eyes, fangs, stingers, and claws. Not just energy, but mass was pouring into him, and his physical form was not prepared to deal with it. In a final burst of triumphant, agonizing sound, the air around Chaina's body imploded, and a flash of purple light blew outward, knocking stones loose from the wall and almost reburying Kamal in rubble. Many silent minutes passed, then Kamal broke the silence by shoving one of the largest stones off of his chest and letting it crash loudly to the floor. The barbarian painfully got to his feet and limped down the hall, to where Chaina arrived. At first Kamal thought his friend was coated in some kind of undulating ooze, but as he looked closer he saw the truth. It was Chaina's body, though he still had the same build and same shape. Chaina's arms, legs, chest, head, and even hair were now a turbulent mass of wriggling monsters. Tiny eyes looked up at Kamal, and miniature fangs formed, struck, then melted again. Sometimes a head or a hand would rise above the surface of the skin, and snakes swam all through the unstable flesh like sharks in a feeding frenzy. His nose and mouth were only shapes, and those shapes were crammed full of tongues and scales and fingers and talons. Even his missing arm had been replaced with a cancer of living monsters. Worst of all were his eyes. Chaina's brilliant blue eyes had returned, and they bore mute and tragic testimony of the agony he suffered. The Mirai had rolled free and sat unobtrusively on the floor. It seemed smaller and drab, its eerie black glow extinguished. Kamal marveled that he and so many others had fought and bled for something that appeared to be nothing more than a spent cannonball, or a discarded child's toy. He knelt down next to Chaina. The hideous parody of his friend's body reacted to his closeness, and Chaina clumsily flopped a boneless arm towards Kamal's hand. Kamal took it, and he fought the urge to release the hideous squirming thing and start hacking at it with a sword. Chaina pulled Kamal's arm, and the barbarian leaned forward to put an ear right next to the place that had been Chaina's mouth.
No, Ra, Re.
Kamal had no idea how the sound was created, but he understood. He shook his head. "You don't need it. It'll only make things worse." Chaina shook his head, his eyes pleading. He tried to point at it with his free arm.
Yours. Take. You. Take it.
"I'm not so sure I want it anymore." Chaina's horrid grip grew tighter.
Oz, he gurgled. Not safe.
"All right, Chainer, I'll take it, and I'll keep it safe." 100 battles had taught him not to argue with a dying man. Chaina's grip relaxed.
Sorry. So sorry.
Kamal held his friend's hand until the squirming stopped, and his ragged breath stopped completely. He stood, remembering the simple courtesy he had paid to dead enemies and allies alike. In this case, it was the least he could do to free Chaina's spirit from the hideous form it had been shackled to. With a wave, Kamal burned Chaina's twisted body to cinders. When he was alone, he caught sight of the Mirai once more, so unassuming in repose. He had told Chaina the truth. He wasn't sure he really wanted to do it anymore, but he also made a promise to his friend, and he thought he understood why Chaina had insisted, and why he had agreed. After a few moments' hesitation, Kamal bent and picked up the Mirai. For a brief moment he saw a huge, smoking battlefield littered with corpses and an ocean of multicolored flames. And then he was alone, surrounded by his memory of monsters and the death of his friend. Epilogue. Loquatus and his mercenaries had explored the length and depth of the chasm, and the news was the same. There was no simple way out, All the water in the chasm was surrounded by Vez's barrier, one giant permanent portal that only led to itself. Anyone who touched the barrier from within or without instantly appeared on the exact opposite side of the chasm, on the same side of the barrier that they had started on. Those inside couldn't step out, those outside couldn't step in. The trap for Loquatus also served as a source of income for Lawan. While Loquatus and his forces were trapped inside, Lawan's functionaries had already fixed a price for merchants to use the portal's external surface as a rapid transit for shipping from one side of Ataria to the other. He was not only trapped, he was isolated from any and all Mer commerce. Disrupting the barrier from inside was costly and difficult, since the field was powered by newly formed tides in the chasm. Penetrating the field required enough magical power to baffle the elemental force of the tides themselves. For the time being, Loquatus couldn't do it alone for long, and he could only open a hole big enough for a few people at a time. Still, he had the resources and the time he needed to breach the barrier. He still had his contacts inside the Order, and the good working relations with the First, should the Cabal Patriarch ever return, and the Mirari was still out there, in the hands of one ignorant savage or another. Loquatus accepted defeat as he did victory. Each was merely a shorter step in his lifelong campaign for greatness. He had been bested and embarrassed in Mer, and it was all his own fault. His mistake was to go after the Mer Imperial throne, and the Mirari at the same time. In the future he would focus all his attention on obtaining the sphere, and then use it to carve out a kingdom for himself. Lawan may have temporarily exiled him from the deep, but that simply meant that he must turn his sights inland. There were 1,000,000 land crawlers to conquer, a dozen factions to play against one another, and a priceless source of power to be obtained. First, the sphere, then Otaria, then the Empire. After that, Loquatus laughed in his spacious prison. If his ambition was as bottomless as the seas, why shouldn't his power extend as far? Kamal stepped out of the Cabal City arena and squinted in the bright setting sun. He was preoccupied by thoughts of the Mirari, the way it reacted so swiftly to its handler's thoughts. Therein lay the real danger of it. Chaina's thoughts had been dark and troubled, and Kamal's own were violent. He wondered what would happen the next time Jeska gave him lip. Would she spontaneously burst into flames because Kamal thought about it? The street was full of surviving spectators and pit fighters. The crowd was murmuring, and all eyes were on the Mirari.
Killed the entire Cabal. The only survivor. I challenge you, barbarian.
Kamal looked up at the Order officer who had stepped forward. She was a tall and immaculate Aven, almost blinding in her white robes. She drew a long sword and a short dagger.
For the Mirari, she continued, I will fight you for the Mirari.
When you've killed her, said a burly Kabbalist, I will fight you for the Mirari.
Then me! I'll fight too!
One of Kamal's own people, a barbarian from the Pardic, stepped forward. Forgive me, cousin, but I will fight you for the Mirari. It is our way. Kamal stared out at the growing number of challenges. His sword felt heavy, and he had never felt so tired. His burns still ached, and for the first time in his short, brutal life, Kamal wanted to rest rather than fight. The other barbarian was right, however. It was their way to compete for the things they wanted, to constantly improve their skills and their situation through combat. Reluctantly, Kamal drew his sword, and almost dropped it from his clumsy, aching hands. He looked at the long line of challengers, growing longer all the time, and the crush of others who edged closer, unwilling to wait for their turn. Warriors and monsters and dementia beasts all jostled for their right to kill him and collect the spoils. Kamal snorted a bitter laugh. Improve according to combat? If he survived the next few hours, according to the ways of his people, he would be very much improved. Fuller and Azza made their way through the plains due south of Cabal City without accident. Azza sometimes forced Fuller to get on her back as she was now, but the caster preferred to have her own feet on the ground. Azza's spirit seemed muted. She was still in mourning for Skellum. Fuller was also sad that she could not see Chaina or Skellum again, but Fuller was easily distracted when she was not in the pits. While she remembered that she was sad, she didn't always remember why. For days before the first surprise announcement that he was leaving, Fuller had strange dreams. They were of a jovial figure who sat on top of a huge pile of money. The figure's voice hurt Fuller's head, and he kept insisting that she should get out of Cabal City and head south. Fuller eventually agreed, just to get the figure to leave her alone. And Azza had refused to let her make the dangerous trip by herself. They were hardly outside the city walls when the commotion at the arena began, but they were too far away to make it back in time for the fun. As they came over a rise in the road, they saw a tall man standing before them in the distance. Many bodies were strewn around his feet, as if his party had all fallen asleep at the same time. When the tall man turned towards them, both Fuller and Azza straightened up.
"The Cabal is here."
"And everywhere,"
replied the first. Closer to the scene, Fuller could see that the bodies of 4 or 5 snake men lay dead and blackened around the first feet, alongside a handful of humans in Cabal clothing. He smiled as his children approached, ignoring the corpses around him.
"It seems we're all going to a Fedo,"
the first said.
"Yes, Pater."
Azza carried Fuller past the first, slowing her pace but not stopping.
"I would offer you Az's pack, Pater," Fuller said, "but that wouldn't be good for either of you." "No, my child. You two go on ahead. I have already sent for an escort from a Fedo, which should be here shortly."
He dipped his head towards the dead at his feet.
"The first 3 escorts were waylaid on the road as soon as they picked me up. Then their waylayers fell ill. Such a waste."
Azza and Fuller were now completely past the first, and the caster had to turn to continue the conversation.
"We shall see you in a Fedo then, Pater." "Indeed, I have much to ask you about the final Mirari games."
"The first is wise."
"Long live the Cabal."
Fuller and Azza rode on over the next rise, and the first disappeared behind them. Azza began to trot, but Fuller tugged on her neck.
"We're in no rush, sweet Azza,"
Fuller said. The hellhound dropped back to a slower pace, and they rode on.